So there has been a lot of uh, talk about the new Israeli government, and I would imagine there are plenty of headlines we could rip from for a whole host of different subjects. For look at them from a Jewish perspective, a Jewish lens. But in particular, the Temple Mount made headlines once again. Not really sure why necessarily, but with everything in Israel, there's always headlines that emerge from pretty much everything that goes on there. As the journalist and author Mati Friedman has noted, is Israel has sort of a geographic area of just some of the smaller states, like New Jersey, or for example, the city of Indianapolis is the same size as Jerusalem, but how much news do we hear from Indianapolis versus how much news comes out of Jerusalem? And that's because it is such a historic, religious place, which so much attracts the attention. And as with anything else in Israel, there's often a lot more heat than light. But if you see in the source number one from the article in last week's Wall Street Journal, a sacred Jerusalem site becomes a flashpoint with Israel's rightward shift. Now, if you would look up about the Temple Mount or about Israel and the Temple Mount or Temple Mount status quo on Google, you would see very similar headlines from the last, dozen years. Every year or two, it comes up again. Someone visits. There's a brouhaha and the like. And this case was something similar. But the fact that there was a visit by Itamar Ben-Gvir, himself a flashpoint of controversy in his role in the new Israeli government. He went up. He did not pray there. He went up for a short visit early before anyone really was there. And that set off a whole discussion, all sorts of headlines. And this is, to take a look at this, some selections from this Wall Street Journal piece, because they always talk about the status quo. So what is the status quo? How did we get a status quo? What does halacha, Jewish law, say about it? But both in terms of, is it permissible to go up to the Temple Mount? Should we go up to the Temple Mount? Those are the types of questions we'll address. We'll start with some of the issues raised in this article. A small group of Jewish men clad in black and white stood in a quiet nook of Jerusalem's holiest site one recent morning, gently rocking and murmuring prayers before Israeli police motioned them to move on. Such a scene would have resulted in arrest just a few years ago for violating a long-standing unofficial agreement between Israel and Islamic religious authorities, which forbids non-Muslims from praying on the site known to Jews as the Temple Mount and to Muslims as the noble sanctuary. But after a decades-long campaign to change the unwritten rules called the status quo, Jewish prayer has become more common and under a new Israeli government could soon become routine. Such a change in one of the region's most contested sites would likely become a renewed flashpoint between Israel and the Muslim world. For example, Ariel Sharon in 2000, his visit there was used as an excuse for the Second Intifada. Marches in Jerusalem and visits to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem Day 2021 led to hostilities, and that was the pretext for Hamas launching rockets just over a year ago. It's a flashpoint. Mr. Ben-Gvir and other Temple Mount activists have used the language of religious equality to promote worship at a site that many Jews revere as the home of the two destroyed ancient Jewish temples. Some want to build a third temple there in the future. Why are Arabs permitted to worship and Jews forbidden? Mr. Ben-Gvir told the Wall Street Journal not long before the November 1st election. I want equal rights. This is something that has been evolving. As a parallel example, every Rosh Chodesh there's a big flashpoint, a big rally, a big protest at the Kotel, the Western Wall, when there are the women of the wall who want to bring a Torah into the women's section, and a small group that want to have egalitarian prayers at the Azarat Yisrael section of the Kotel. And it's a protest, makes for a good PR theater. It really is, there is, some angry behavior on both sides, which probably should be avoided. But somehow everyone gets their goat up when it comes to equal rights for worship. And that's the argument that are used by the women of the wall, and that's the argument being used by those who want to go on the Temple Mount. It's kind of interesting that those who want equal rights on the Temple Mount usually would be protesting the women of the wall, and those women of the wall would be protesting or wouldn't really be in favor of those who want to go on the Temple Mount. It's the not surprisingly strange bedfellows of religion and politics. But it's really been the last 20 years or so that the equal rights argument and religious freedom has been utilized as one of the rationales for Jews worshiping on the Temple Mount, and has been invoked by another headline of the day, the Israeli Supreme Court, when they overturned the convictions of or released Jews arrested for praying on the Temple Mount who appealed their arrest. They were released under the argument of freedom of worship. How that applies with regards to public safety and the like, there's going to be obviously at times the two will collide. We'll see that from a religious perspective as well. But equal rights. Muslims get to pray on Temple Mount. Jews should pray on the Temple Mount. The site is administered by Jordanian religious authorities as part of the unofficial agreement after Israel won control of East Jerusalem from Jordan in 1967 Six-Day War. Israel kept the administration in place to calm tensions after the war. Under the status quo, tourists can come inside the walls during limited hours. Jews who want to visit as pilgrims must remove religious items, are escorted by police, and aren't allowed to pray. Activists want pilgrims to be allowed to openly pray inside the compound while donning traditional religious garb and freely display nationalist symbols like the Israeli flag. In 2004, around 6,000 Jewish worshippers entered the Temple Mount, according to Biyadenu, right, which means in our hands. That's a play on the very famous Har Habayit Biyadenu declaration made when Israel captured the hotel and the Temple Mount in the Six-Day War. And so that Temple Mount activist group is called Biyadenu because many have pointed out that declaration rings hollow if Jews aren't allowed to visit. It's not Biyadenu. So this group is advocating for more a real literalist Biyadenu. In 2022, it was nearly 48,000, right? So in 18 years, eightfold increase. Nearly 2,000 a day during Jewish holidays. Samir Sinjilawi, an East Jerusalem activist for Palestinian Fatah political party, said he is concerned that Mr. Ben-Gvir could allow Jews to sacrifice animals on the site. As a lawyer, Mr. Ben-Gvir defended Jewish activists arrested for trying to slaughter a goat there as part of an ancient Passover ritual once performed in the temples on the site. Right, that's something else that we every year there's always a headline in a picture in the Israeli press of someone taking a goat trying to get into the Temple Mount on Erev Pesach to reenact the Karban Pesach. Just as a side note, also on January 11th in the AP, here was a headline that parallels this one. Detroit area city okays animal sacrifice for religious reasons. This was in a place called Hamtramck, Michigan, near Detroit. It has a large Muslim population. The city council explicitly approved the practice of animal sacrifice at home for religious reasons. Another step in recognizing a cultural shift in the city whose 20th century history was shaped by Polish immigrants. And so they were talking about how Muslims often slaughter animals, typically goats or sheep, for the holy days of Eid al-Adha. And they had voted initially to continue the ban on animal slaughter, but they decided if someone wants to do it, they have a right to do their practice as long as they follow the regulations in place. So it's not only Jews who want to be able to sacrifice; it's also the Muslims. And we'll talk a little bit about, so can we sacrifice today without a temple? And finally, from the article, and again, the sources are in the chat for those who didn't click on them yet. Palestinians say they are concerned that any concessions to Jewish worship will lead to the site's partition, and they would face limitations on accessing the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's the situation at the Ibrahimi Mosque, where the Cave of the Patriarchs in the West Bank of Hebron, a site that is holy to both Judaism and Islam, once exclusively reserved for Muslims. On a recent weekday morning, Muslim worshiper Ali Al-Haji looked at quietly praying Jews, Israelis with anxiety. They don't really believe what they claim, that they're here for peaceful purposes. They're here to build another temple. said Mr. Al-Hiji, an electrician from Nazareth in northern Israel. Their intentions aren't about coexistence. So those are some of the details of the story. We'll start any questions, comments, reactions before we tackle whether it is halachically acceptable for Jews who walk on the Temple Mount, worship on the Temple Mount. What are some of the contemporary views? How did we get to where we are? And then maybe we'll also talk a little bit more conceptually and touch upon sacrifices as well. But first, any questions, comments, reactions?
Rabbi, do you have any views on the subject?
I will be getting to those.
I hope before the hour is over.
You know, maybe I thought maybe I would wait and give this class from the Temple Mount next time I'm in Israel. But any other reactions? You know, we could go around. Anyone here been to on the Temple Mount?
I
I have, yeah.
All right.
My first trip to Israel, before I knew that it was with American Jewish Congress. It was 1971 in the fall, and that was before I knew that you weren't supposed to, and I went into the mosque also.
Wait, I thought I was there too, but we didn't have that side of town in 1961.
No, 71.
Oh, I thought you said 61.
No,
All right.
no, in fact, I always know when it is because my daughter was born 9 months later, but she wasn't made in Israel. She was made in Brooklyn.
Well, look, you know, it does raise interest. You know, one of the issues surrounding going on to the Temple Mount has to do with purity and impurity, which, you know, from a halachic Jewish legal point of view, will be different for men and women. You know, in terms of the fact that, you know, when it comes to ritual impurity for women, the idea of nida and the idea of going to mikveh is a, you know, is part of a cycle for many observant Jewish women. So how that plays out, we'll touch upon also.
Rabbi,
Anyone else been up? Yeah.
yeah, Rabbi, I was there in 67, right after the war,
Wow.
and it was totally verboten by the rabbinate to go up to Har HaBayit because they didn't know exactly where Kodesh Kodashim was. That
Right.
was the reason we were given.
Right.
It was nothing about women and neither.
Right. Well, so let's, you know, anyone else want to share their visits there? Otherwise, we'll start doing, you know, we'll go right into the sources. So essentially, we know, and we talked about this, actually, I think in our last session, we talked about the sanctity of the synagogue and playing pickleball there or not, that there is this idea of respecting the synagogue, and there's also this idea of Morah HaMikdash. You're supposed to venerate the Temple Mount. And this is, we know that only certain places were accessible to some people. We know that the Kohen had access to more of the space. And we know that the Zar, the stranger, who was not a Kohen, couldn't go into places. Kohen himself could only go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. Right, so there's a lot of potential trespass, religious trespass that's involved in the Temple Mount. And that has always been the case. And for those who may have visited some of the excavations, and when they talk about, especially the City of David excavations, the Pilgrim's Road, and they talk about places where there were mikvahs on the road so people could become pure, to even enter the areas where everyone was welcome to participate. You know, they had areas up to a certain point non-Jews could go. So we know that it was not kind of general admission. There were places that you could be and places that you couldn't be. But that was when there was a temple. What about when there's no temple? And you know, so you can't go into the temple. What about the space where the temple is? And it has to do with whether or not the sanctity is objective and permanent or not. Right? And when we talk about things like sanctity or purity and impurity, these are more religious concepts. Right? You know, if something is holy, can it become unholy by the fact that the status has changed? And so the Rambam, Maimonides, very famously mentions, this is source number 2, even though the temple is now in ruin because of our sins, a person must hold the site in awe, as one would regard when it was standing. Therefore, one should only enter a region which he is permitted to enter. He should not sit in the area of the temple courtyard, nor should he act frivolously when standing before the place of the eastern gate. as is implied, you shall observe my Sabbaths and revere my sanctuary. Why do you have both of these together, Sabbath and sanctuary, in the same verse? Just as the observance of the Sabbath applies for eternity, so too the reverence for the temple must be eternal. Even though it is in ruin, it remains holy. Right? This touches upon what Judy mentioned before in terms of her experience with the Temple Mount. You don't know where is the holy part, so you can't go because you have to be in the proper state of religious purity. So if you don't know where you can go, where you can't go, you should stay away. But the Rambam very famously says the sanctity of the space is objective and remains in place even though the temple has been destroyed. He talks about this idea, but where does that come from? Like, why is this space holy if there's no temple? It's not being used as a holy space. So he says in the source number 3, how is the second temple consecrated? With the first consecration performed by Solomon, for he consecrated the temple courtyard in Jerusalem for that time and for eternity. Right? The idea of the temple space, once it became a temple space, it's always a temple space for all eternity. And the expression in the Talmud, some of you may have studied the material before. Kicha l'shata, kicha le'ati lavo. If it was when it comes to the temple, and also here he mentions Jerusalem, when it was sanctified at its time, it was sanctified forever. Now this is a machloka. This is a dispute in the Talmud, and the Rambam is those siding with temple was holy; it's always holy. The Raavad, right? The Raavad is the bar plukta. Bar plukta means the disputant. He's the one who always, when he feels the Rambam has made a mistake or is wrong, he always is the one to comment. So the Raavad points out this position is the Rambam's own idea. I don't know his source. There are a number of places where the Mishnah mentions the fact the holiness is removed when there is no temple. It is clear to me that the sanctity of the temple in Jerusalem is not forever. Therefore, one who enters the Temple Mount today is not liable for karet. Karet is the spiritual punishment of being cut off from the Jewish people. So the Raavad disagrees. The Raavad says there is no sanctity. Now, he doesn't say you're allowed to enter, but he says that you won't be liable for the maximum punishment by going there. So you have basically two approaches. The Temple Mount is as sacred as it always was. That's the Rambam. And if that's the case, you can only go into the temple and you must follow all the procedures of going and behaving there, just like at that time. Or you have the Raavad who says the sanctity is not there and you can go, and if you make a mistake, it's not going to be so terrible because the sanctity is not there anymore. There could be other side laws or other restrictions that might apply to your going into the Temple Mount, but it's not the prohibitions and the limitations are not fully in place. So you have a machlokas, Rambam and Raavad. So who do you follow? Well, the Magen Avraham is Rabbi Avram Gombiner, writing in the 19th century, commenting on the Code of Jewish Law, Shulchan Aruch. Right, why is this discussed in Shulchan Aruch? So the chapter 561 of Orach Chaim is describing mourning Jerusalem. It's within right after the laws of Tisha B'Av, that we have an idea that we should mourn the temple always. And this is expressed in different rituals, different practices. Some leave a corner of a wall unfinished. We break a glass out of chuppah. And there are those who will tear kriya, rend their garments upon seeing the Temple Mount without a temple. So these are ways we mourn the temple. So within that discussion, the Magen Avraham notes, talks about the Temple Mount, and he says Rambam rules that the holiness of the courtyard and of Jerusalem is eternal. Right? The Raavad disagree. The words of the Rambam are correct. That one who enters the place of the Mikdash is liable for karet because we are all tamei meit. We are all ritually impure because we've come into contact directly or indirectly with corpses or people who came into contact with corpses. We require the purification process of the para aduma, the red heifer. We don't have it. Magen Avraham deciding for us, Rambam is right, and we are impure, and we cannot ascend the Temple Mount. This view is also quoted by Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Kook, first chief rabbi of Israel, in his responsa. And he says that this is the majority opinion, follows the Rambam. right? He says, Habrura v'hamuchletet. This is the decisive opinion of Jewish law, is to follow the Rambam. And this is the approach that's taken in most of the mentions in the Talmud, and that even if the original sanctity of the land of Israel is not forever, the Temple Mount is always sacred forever, and this is the established law in Israel. And so, when it comes to whether one may ascend the Temple Mount or not, you have the Rambam who says that it is always as sacred as it has been when there was a temple. You can't go up if you're impure. We're all impure in one form or another. Don't go up. The Ravad leaves open the possibility of, well, it's not as objectively sacred as it always was. Maybe there's some wiggle room. Maybe we should be able to go up. However, the sign near the Temple Mount, you see it there in number 7, a picture of it, right? According to the Torah, it's forbidden for any person to enter the temple area of the Temple Mount due to its sacredness. This is the chief rabbinate of Israel. So you have a machlokes, and you seem to have the halachic position following the Rambam. Many of the great decisors of Jewish law have followed that position, and you can't go up. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, right, chief rabbi of Israel in the 1980s, major Sephardic figure of Jewish law. Ascending the Temple Mount in the area of the Beit HaMikdash is strictly and completely forbidden nowadays, since we're ritually impure due to contact with the corpse, tamei meit. One who is impure like this is liable for karet. Basically, you can't go. So how can people say you can't go? What's the opening? What do you think? You have some, you can say Rambam versus Ravad. So it seems everyone seems to follow the Rambam. When the Ravad, no one seems to be following the Ravad. What is the opening to have for this to take place, for ascending to the Temple Mount? Yes.
What do you think the majority of Israelis today, where would they stand?
So the majority of Israelis, there have been some surveys with regard to whether or not the Jews should be allowed to worship on the Temple Mount. I think most Israelis don't think about it. Just like it comes to the Western Wall and the Kotel and women of the wall, those types of issues, most Israelis don't think about it. It's not high on their list of priorities in terms of going or trying to go. I guess if you move into the more religious Zionist public, you'll have more people thinking about it. The majority rabbinic view, really almost across the board in the ultra-Orthodox community, and many of the senior rabbis and leadership in the religious Zionist community also follow this view. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef in that decision is very dismissive of those who would permit going up to the Temple Mount. And it is interesting, and this was mentioned. Judy mentioned this, and Phyllis mentioned this. Judy mentioned in '67 already verboten. Phyllis mentioned not necessarily being aware of the prohibition or the negative view of going up. Really, in 1967, there was that moment of what should be done. And initially, the chief of Rabbi of the IDF then, Rabbi Goren, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, a very prominent religious Zionist figure, and hero and soldier and Talmud Chacham scholar who became chief rabbi of Israel. He was a big fan of trying to move the needle, like im lo achshav ematai. On the last day of the 1967 war, there's an article written by the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. The Chief Rabbinic Council met to discuss the Temple Mount because it was something that was relevant, and essentially they punted. You have the Rambam, you have the Magen Avraham, you have Rav Kook, you have many other opinions about the difficulty about it being forbidden. You can't ascend because it's forbidden. First of all, Jewish law hasn't really paid much attention to the Temple Mount because we never really had access. Starting really in the 1800s, there was a discussion about renewing sacrifices. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer was one of the rabbis who were part of this Chovevei Tzion movement, which preceded Herzl's political Zionism. There was a religious Zionism. some of the students of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Eliyahu of Vilna, right, 18th century major Jewish rabbinic figure, who had great love for Zion. His primary students made Aliyah. That was one of the first Aliyahs that introduced new blood, new people, an Aliyah into what was then called the Old Yishuv in Israel. They were the ones starting to think about being back in Israel, and a lot of it was theoretical. Right? There was a famous discussion about whether sacrifices can be brought nowadays, which talked about, well, on the one hand, no, because there's no temple, or maybe you don't need a temple. And the discussion was to try and unpack all of these sources as to whether or not it might be the possibility to have sacrifices without a temple. But there really wasn't the ability or the access or the means to do so. It was very theoretical. It was kind of on the precipice for this being relevant, right? This is kind of a pre-state Israel. Even Rav Kook's discussions about this. Rav Kook died in 1935. He really didn't have the authorities, right? And very famously, the one of the dramatic sagas in Rav Kook's time was whether or not Jews could blow the shofar at the Kotel, right? Especially starting in the 1920s, with the rise of Arab nationalism in 1929, the terrible pogrom against the Jews of Hebron. There was a sense that the British introduced various steps for the Jews not to be taking statements or actions that would promote their claim on these religious places. So they weren't allowed to blow the shofar, and it was an annual ritual that someone would sneak in a shofar and blow it and try to get away before getting arrested by the British. So a lot of the discussion had been very much in the hypothetical, and all of a sudden here comes 1967, and it's practical. And so, as always, we're generally a small c conservative religion, and halacha is not in for making giant leaps forward. And you happen to have a mosque occupying a central part of this Temple Mount, and there's also the political sensibilities. And some would raise the fact that, as we see to this day, Muslims refuse to accept or believe that the Jews are interested in coexistence. And some of the Jews themselves talk about how nice it would be for there to be a temple there instead of mosques. They talk about transferring, the Dome of the Rock somewhere else so they could build a temple. It became a powder keg. In fact, you talk about powder keg. Shlomo Goren, Rabbi Goren, suggested that they put explosives into the Temple Mount, because with all of the bullets flying, maybe a stray bullet would hit the mosque and set off the explosives and blow it up in the waning days of the 6-Day War, and there would go the problem. Let's just say Moshe Dayan was very opposed to that suggestion. Moshe Dayan, in fact, was the one who demanded that the Israeli flag that had been hung at the top of the Dome of the Rock be taken down. There has always been the sensitivity. Everyone is, we talk about from the headlines and this new government raising the stakes. Everyone is talking about how Prime Minister Netanyahu a year ago said that you don't want to change the Temple Mount status quo, and he continues to, insinuate this idea because you don't want to ignite the passions, spark a powder keg with 1 billion Muslims. But 1967 provided that first opportunity, and Rav Goren, who was a visionary, was thinking about how can we restore the Jewish presence to the Temple Mount, whether it be visiting, whether it be praying. This then opened up the whole question of whether the rabbis of that day and continuing to this day really want to go against some of the very prominent established positions. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef is correct that everyone has generally leaned towards Maimonides. Magen Avram leans towards Maimonides. Rabbi Kook, right, the first great chief rabbi whose views were universally respected, even if there was sometimes disagreement, said no to the Temple Mount. Look, source number 9. One small trespass on the holiness of our eternal Beit HaMikdash negates the merit of the establishment of the settlements in the land of Israel. Right? We have to venerate the Temple Mount. And here we are, we're talking about going back onto it. We're not sure the exact locations, the measurements. We have a lot of details of the Second Temple, but and archaeological finds have given us more insight and information. But For example, they talk about sizes of things. They talk about cubits, amot, and we know how many amot it was in different directions. But how big is an amot? Right? They talk about, is it 52 centimeters? Is it 58 centimeters? Is it a foot and a half? Is it a foot? Is it 14 inches? Is it 16 inches? Is it 18 inches? There's something called the Machon HaMikdash, the Temple Institute, which provides a lot of information, a lot of details. And they've done a lot of research into this. They're the ones who are recreating some of the vessels of the temple so that they can be used. They've already created the menorah, some of the horns, and some of the dishes to be used for the sacrifices, the clothes of the Kohen Gadol and the Kohanim. But we still don't have, we're not 100% sure. And it's really very much built into our religious consciousness that the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, the third Beit HaMikdash, will come when Mashiach comes. So are these messianic times or not? There was actually a meeting of the chief rabbis in the 1980s. I think it was when it was Rabbi Shapiro, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, were in New York together. They met with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, who we know has spent a lot of focus on Mashiach. And the three of them declared there's no reason for Mashiach not to come. These are messianic times. Oh, so if these are messianic times, we should build a temple. So there's a lot of, all of a sudden, 1967 was a huge shock and a transformation on all sorts of levels for Israel and the Jewish nation. And the Temple Mount was wrapped into that whole brand new package. Rabbi Goren was thinking ahead, and the other rabbis, for the most part, were remaining somewhat conservative, anchored in place. We have the precedents, we have the Rambam, we have Magen Avraham, we have Rav Kook, we have so many, the consensus sides with not going up. And let's face it, it's going to be very complicated once we start going up. And that led to that decision of the chief rabbinate to forbid entry to the Temple Mount, which really dominated the rabbinic consensus, dominated the entirety of the Hasidic, Haredi and Hasidic consensus. It was the chief rabbinate consensus. Rav Goren continued to raise issues and make suggestions for Jewish presence on the Temple Mount. Some of you will remember that he had a shul and a kollel right against the Temple Mount. Was called Ha'idra. That was his kollel. It's an area right where Netiv Aryeh, Yeshiva Netiv Aryeh is today. And he was very committed to teaching and discussing and doing things. He himself backed away from his more strident advocacy for Jews on the Temple Mount. It could be that the initial excitement and passion of the victory of the Six-Day War, all the realities began to come in. Where exactly can Jews go? What kind of purification is needed? The political realities, what that would mean for soldiers and the like, protecting Jews there. So even he shifted some of his advocacy towards building a synagogue on the Temple Mount. That became something that those who were not in favor of wholesale visits of Jews to the Temple Mount, right next to the wall, to put up a synagogue that would have a glass far wall. You wouldn't be able to go further into the Temple Mount, but you'd be able to pray on the Temple Mount, seeing the Temple Mount. And that was, where things were in the years following the Six-Day War. And that consensus held for quite some time. Really, when you talk about, what about all these rabbis today? What about all this, happening today? The rabbinic consensus hasn't changed very much, but people start pulling on the Rav Goren strand. They pull on, for example, Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, who was in favor of that synagogue being built on the Temple Mount. They pull on that strand. They, reiterate and amplify the views that say you could have sacrifices today, even without a temple, if you try and be careful, or if you have the right purification process. But that was something that, that stymied the rabbinic establishment in the immediate aftermath of the Six-Day War. One of the things that, according to some reports, Rav Goren was not sure how to handle the issue of women going up to the Temple Mount in terms of their purity and impurity. With men, the issue of going to mikvah covers everything except the impurity from coming into contact with the dead. With women, it has to do with timing and when they go to the mikvah. So there are all sorts of complications, and the situation in general from the rabbinic establishment continue to reinforce and support this ban forbidding entry. But the conversation continued. Source number 10, Rabbi Zivotofsky talking about the issue. In recent years, the question regarding the advisability of ascending Har HaBayit under the present circumstances has been addressed in great detail by many leading rabbis. Those who forbid entering the area do so because of the fear of violating the laws pertaining to its sanctity. Advocates insist on extreme caution and intense reverence, but see a value in establishing connection between the Jewish people and the awesome holiness of Judaism's most sanctified site. You begin to see, while if the prohibition of going into the Temple Mount was based on halachic precedent, while recognizing, look, even if there's sanctity, you can still maybe purify yourself enough to go, but essentially halachic prohibition. We have opportunity, we can be more careful, we need to show and demonstrate our connection to the Temple Mount. Rav Goren had wanted to, there are a couple other opinions out there, so it began to, you had a competing desire. You had a competing desire which didn't have a competing cast of rabbinic authorities permitting it. Right, I'm not judging which rabbi is greater than another, but just in terms of the list of those who continue to forbid going up, it is significantly longer and more well-known than the number that allow or encourage going up. And so for example, source number 11, Rabbi Jachter talks about asking this question to Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. In fact, when this author asked Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik what he felt about the subject, the Rav responded immediately by quoting the Rambam that Mashiach will build the Beit HaMikdash. Interestingly, Rav Shechter told the author that this Ramban shows that those who want to build the third Beit HaMikdash today are incorrect. In addition, when this author asked Rabbi Yehuda Amital's opinion regarding this question, Rabbi Yehuda Amital was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Har Etzion, Gush Yeshiva. The latter responded by citing Rav Kook's assertion that divine providence works through the halacha. Therefore, if there currently exist halachic impediments from rebuilding the Beit HaMikdash, this indicates that the divine will does not wish the Beit HaMikdash should be built today through human hands. Right? The Temple Institute would disagree with this view, but here you have a more conservative approach towards Mashiach and redemption and building the Beit HaMikdash, and Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Amital felt it's not our place to do so. But Rav Amital recently stated, this is going back a number of years, since Rav Amital has since passed away, it's profoundly wrong for the Israeli government to relinquish sovereignty over the Temple Mount. Although we're unable to offer karbanot today, sacrifices, we should take steps to reaffirm our connection to the Beit HaMikdash. So this idea of you shouldn't go, but you should remain connected, over time, I think led to a shift in the religious Zionist consciousness. Right, if you talk about Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich as being part of that religious Zionist party, they're from technically different parties, but they joined together. Within the religious Zionist consciousness, there became a very fundamental shift from the focus more on the religious side of religious Zionism to the Zionism side of the religious Zionism. And really, with the rise of the Gush Emuni movement, in terms of expanding Jewish presence throughout the land of Israel, building yeshuvim, asserting a presence became a priority in the religious Zionist camp. And therefore, even if the majority of the rabbinic opinion still remains more conservative, opposing going up to the Temple Mount, well, the ethos within the religious Zionist mind, heart, soul to assert Jewish sovereignty and Jewish control, the Jewish presence, began to compete with the purely religious views. And since there are rabbis who would permit it, it began to have a greater hold on the religious Zionist public. And you see, it's definitely much more popular. We saw the eightfold rise in the last 15 years or so. And this, there is rabbinic opinion that allows it. There are people who go. Not everyone is necessarily advocating such visits, even if they permit such visits. One exception was Rabbi Moshe Tendler, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Rabbi Tendler passed away just a couple of years ago. There's some very well-watched YouTube clips of his visit to the Temple Mount, he would be very careful going to the mikvah. Wouldn't wear leather shoes. He wouldn't even carry a leather wallet. His focus was make sure to do it in the right place with the right level of purity. But it has led to an increased desire or tolerance for visiting, even while the chief rabbinate and much of the rabbinic opinion is against it. And a lot of it is either from a political perspective of wanting to show control and presence. At the same time, there's a great, Rav Amital expresses it, right? Even though that you shouldn't visit, even if it's technically forbidden, you can't build a temple now. You shouldn't give up the connection to the Temple Mount. And Rav Kook, very concerned with the sanctity of the Temple Mount, and desecrating it negates all of the efforts to build the land of Israel. Source number 12 from Rav Kook. The force that sustains the soul of the Jewish people is its incredible yearning to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash and to restore its glory to its perfect state. Only this yearning has uplifted the spirit of all the generations to know that there is a lofty purpose to their lives and historic continuity. In this lofty point is hidden the lifeblood of the connection of the Jewish people have to Eretz Yisrael. All of the mitzvot that are contingent upon Eretz Yisrael, to whatever extent they apply, preserve the vitality of this fundamental dew of life, right? In his spiritual language, Rav Kook, who said you're not allowed to go up to the Temple Mount, right? The sanctity remains in place, still there has to be that connection. So if you are starting to see a shift within the religious Zionist ethos from religious Zionism to a more muscular assertion of political Zionism from within a religious context, and you have some opinions that support it, and you have statements like Rav Kook and Rav Amital, which encourage a connection to the Temple Mount, and you have a more decentralized age where people don't really listen to rabbinic authority the same way, you can see that there's a growing interest in focusing on the positives of going up to the Temple Mount, and you start throwing in equal rights and religious rights that are become a rallying cry that even the Israeli Supreme Court seems to support, or at least in that case supported. All of this leads to a more a heightened interest and appetite for ascending the Temple Mount. Now, I will admit that to me it seems that there is room to allow it. At the same time, the definitive rulings of the chief rabbinate, in particular the way its analysis by Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and also the way Rav Kook is concerned that the trespass on the holiness of the Temple Mount is something that makes me a little bit more bullish about endorsing visits and going there. It would seem to be for me, it's a question of what's the intent, what's the purpose, why am I going? Is it for me? Is it a desire to stand there? Why go there? It's similar to how some people look at the Kotel, the Western Wall. Is it a spiritual place? Is that the only place I can daven well, and the like? It seems that the analysis that we were talking about here, the fact that you have the majority of halachic positions seems to be against going to the Temple Mount, while those who are going don't seem to be fully focused on the religious element of it, but is more from to make a statement. I'm not making any arrangements just yet to visit. At the same time, I'm cognizant of the other view, Rav Goren, who championed it from the very beginning, and those who, from a halachic perspective, followed in his footsteps. But I think the main interest is not exclusively from a religious point of view or a religious freedom point of view or a halachic point of view. There's something else at play, and we'll see how it turns out. It's one of those cases that while there are plenty of things that the chief rabbinate says or does, or some of their positions which I disagree with, it seems here that in this case they decided to stop the clock and not pursue further investigation, recognizing that the halachic realities and the political realities and the geographic and the military realities were all such that this doesn't rise to the level of trying to find a more creative solution. And that definitely resonates with my worldview. happy to take any further questions, comments, reactions on the subject, and otherwise we'll pick up next week with another headline.
Rabbi